Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining me. My name is Cory Mertz. I'm a managing partner here at Mertz Taggart. We are a healthcare services, mergers and acquisitions firm. We're hyper-focused on two vertical industries within healthcare services. The first is in-home care, which includes home health, home care, and hospice. And I head up our in-home care division. And my partner, Kevin, heads up our behavioral health division, where we tend to focus on a lot of outpatient mental health, treatment centers, addiction treatment centers, eating disorder, autism services, and the like. We focus in the lower middle market. These are transactions that typically have an enterprise value of somewhere between $3 million and $100 million. Which sounds like a wide range, but in the M&A world, where you see transactions in some cases, 44 billion, I think Elon Musk paid for Twitter. We really are in the lower middle market, and that has some unique characteristics to it. We've been fortunate enough to complete right around 125 transactions over our period of doing transactions. Which really goes back to 2006. Now, we started Mertz Taggart in 2014. Okay, so a little bit about me. I started my healthcare M&A career in 2006 doing in-home care services. So been doing it for doing transaction work for about 16 years now. Which feels like about 30. No, it's a long time in the industry for sure, and humbled and have been fortunate enough to have a lot of successes along the way. In the in-home care space, I've completed a little over 70 transactions during that period of time, and so I've enjoyed a lot of success. And with that, we've learned a lot of lessons. Some of them have been hard lessons, and so my goal today is to share some of those hard lessons with you, so you don't make those same mistakes that perhaps we made early on, or I made early on in my healthcare M&A career. So what are we going to go through today? So we're going to start by just talking about the fundamental value drivers of a home care business. Now, a lot of this will not be new concepts to you all. However, I'm going to present it perhaps in a little bit of a different context than you've seen it before. But these are some of the things that you've been doing and continue to do over the life of your business, and that's building the value of your company. And then we're going to talk a little bit more about the process of capturing that value. So how do you make sure you're getting the best deal you can? So that's going to include pulling together the right information for the buyer universe. Obviously, developing an A-list type buyer list that you're going to reach out to, and by doing that, creating competition among those buyers, and reminding them throughout that this is a competitive process. Once you get you've selected your buyer that you want to kind of go down the path with, and do due diligence and execute a purchase agreement and ultimately sell the company. You want to make sure you mitigate the risk of renegotiation as you go through the process, and all of that while maintaining confidentiality. Okay, so let's talk about maximizing value. Now, the first step, a lot of you are doing this right now, and these are things you do every day, and will spend the first several years of your career doing, and that's building the value of your company. We're going to talk about some of the things you can do to build the value, including growing, looking at managing margins, perhaps doing an acquisition. These are all things that can help you really build the value of your company. So you spend the first, let's just say 2 years to maybe 30 years or more, really building the value of your company. And then you're going to spend the last 5 to 8 months capturing the value. And so something that doesn't get talked about a lot is really the process for making sure you're capturing maximum value. So we're going to talk about what we think is the best approach for doing that. We're going to pull back the curtain a little bit and just talk about the process that we use. And by the way, you can do this yourself. And so that's That is the intent here is really to share with you how we do it so that you have at least the option of doing it yourself. And the results are significant. Okay, so let's start off with the fundamental value equation that we see all the time. I think a lot of folks are already pretty familiar with this equation. And it goes like this. Enterprise value of your company is equal to the adjusted EBITDA times the multiple. Okay. Adjusted EBITDA is really just the normalized cash flow that the agency has produced over time. It's as if the buyer owned the agency, usually before any kind of synergies, and it usually applies to a 12-month period, although those things will get negotiated in an actual transaction. That's the definition of adjusted EBITDA. So it's a normalized cash flow over a 12-month period, essentially. The multiple is all about risk. It's an inverse of risk. So the higher the risk of the cash flow or the adjusted EBITDA declining after a sale, the lower the multiple the company will command. Conversely, the lower risk that things will deteriorate after a transaction, the higher a multiple a buyer will be willing to pay. So we do a lot of exit planning work with folks around the industry, and one of the first things that we'll do, obviously we'll do a valuation, but we like to really break this down a little bit further, whereby the adjusted EBITDA is really, it's the revenue that the company is generating times the adjusted EBITDA margin. So basically, how efficient the company is at generating cash flow based on your revenue. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, but I break these into three parts for a reason. And then of course, we talk about the multiple, which is always the measuring stick for a successful transaction. Okay, so I want to give you an illustration. I had an owner come in. Well, he didn't actually come into the office, but I met him at a conference. And this was 2018, and he wanted to really start planning his exit. He wasn't sure if he was able to get, what his magic number was, which was 10 million at the time. But what I shared with him, what we always do is, well, let's just start and see where you are currently, and then we can determine what the next step is. If it makes sense to go to market, if we can get you 10 million, then let's do it. If not, let's figure out what the plan is so that we can get you that number. So these are the numbers. We took a look at it. They were doing about $8.5 million in revenue. This was a Medicare home health agency, so $8.5 million in revenue. Right buyer, right time, right margin structure, checks all the boxes. Could potentially generate 10 million in enterprise value, but certainly the devil's in the details on this one. So he's doing about $8.5 million in revenue. Margins were good, 16%. That's better than most, as they say. But there's opportunity for improvement, at least in terms of maximizing enterprise value. Buyers like to see, or I should say, they'll give credit for, up to 20% EBITDA margin for a strong Medicare home health agency. Sometimes a little bit more than that, but up to 20%. So there's a little bit of meat on the bone on this one. He was generating 16% margin. We tend to be fairly conservative in the guidance that we give, because going to market is a big decision. So I think we established guidance right around a 5.5 times range, and so that got him to an enterprise value of about $7.5 million. We agreed that he had a little bit of work to do. He recognized that PDGM was not necessarily top of mind, but it was time to start getting his ducks in order for PDGM, because that was going to become more of an issue as we got further into 2019 and 2020. So went off and grew the business a little bit, really focused on some facility referrals to help really maximize some of the reimbursement under PDGM. Came back in 2020. This was late 2020 now, after the kind of the first wave of the pandemic had passed, right when the wave of transactions started to hit, really in the third and fourth quarter of 2020. And we took it to market. And here's what the agency had done at that point in time. So took his revenue from $8.5 million to $10 million. Was able to improve their margin, really get it up to that 20%, which is the sweet spot for M&A, in my opinion. 15 to 20% is always sweet for home health. I would say for hospice, perhaps 15 to 25%. For home care, whether it be private duty or Medicaid, sweet spot is typically somewhere in the 10 to 20%, depending on the state. So in this case, got his margin up to 20%. Now the industry had turned a little bit, had gotten a little bit stronger, so values had gone up a little bit. Ended up getting a 7 times, so 14 million in total enterprise value. So we got 87% more than the guidance that I had given them in 2018, just by, and I say just by, I realize this is easier said than done, increasing his revenue from 8.5 million to 10 million. And his EBITDA margin from 16% to 20%. And candidly, the market improved a little bit. Okay. So when we talk about enterprise value, I think it's important to mention enterprise value, we're really talking about cash at close. And when I talk about cash at close, we're really talking about the cash that the buyer is putting down on the transaction at the close. Any other consideration needs to be discounted. I mention this because I know a lot of you are getting approached by individuals, a lot of whom are cash strapped. They can oftentimes give you the value that you're looking for, but the terms are not necessarily ideal. So cash, if you look at the different forms of consideration, cash is king. You don't have to discount that at all. Right. Every transaction does have a holdback. That's just for any kind of indemnification claim that a buyer would make after the sale. Don't see those happen very often. Most of the time, that holdback is held in the form of escrow. So the buyer is actually putting the cash in escrow. It has your name on it, and they have to make a claim and go through a process in order to get any of that money out of the escrow. So it makes it hard to get. It's your money unless they make a claim and are successful in their claim. Some of the more cash-strapped buyers will suggest putting the holdback in the form of a seller note. They'll say, doesn't make sense for this money to be tied up, which totally agree. But from a seller's perspective, it is important, because if you're counting on them to pay you, and things start to go south a little bit, and perhaps this is a little bit of a cash strapped buyer, you're going to have to perhaps work to get that money from them, that just the holdback money that should be your money. Seller financing, same thing. We rarely, I don't know that we've ever seen seller financing in any of our transactions. But again, we tend to focus on the A-list buyers, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. But again, some of the buyers that have a harder time putting together the full purchase price at the closing may request seller financing, but you're going to have to discount that quite a bit. Finally, would be the earnout and contingent payment. You see this a lot, especially in healthcare services, and really, I would say in the private duty sector more than anything. Buyers get very nervous that business is going to fall off after the transaction. They will often structure a contingent payment that you'll receive, as long as the company doesn't fall off, as long as the business doesn't fall off over a short period of time after the closing, which it very well can do. So you're going to have to discount that. Any kind of earnout or contingent payment, in my opinion, should be considered icing on the cake. Okay, so let's talk about building value real quick, and we're going to touch on really kind of the 6 most common ways that we see folks building value. The first is to grow, right? So what impact will growing have on let's just look at the valuation formula that we presented to you with revenue, EBITDA margin, and multiple. So if you grow the company, what's going to change there? What are you going to impact? So obviously, if you grow, revenue is going to grow, right? So that part of the equation is going to go up. But you're also going to command a higher multiple. All things equal, bigger companies command higher multiples than smaller companies. So if you look at for example, the publicly traded companies, Amedisys, LHC Group, Aviana, Addus, Pennant Group. And if you look at their multiples over the last couple of years, most of them have traded, somewhere in the mid-teens up into the mid-30s of multiples. You don't normally see that with smaller companies. And the reason for that is because they're big. So if they have a problem in one part of the company, if they have a few locations that aren't performing, if they have a reimbursement hit, they've got the infrastructure to recover and kind of smooth over some of those hits. Whereas a smaller company, if you look at the opposite, if it's a mom and pop, which a lot of us are, and you're doing a lot of the work, and you've got you've got just a few clinicians, maybe 1 or 2 marketers, and you lose 1 or 2 of those marketers, that can have a significant impact on the cash flow of the business. So the multiple will typically go down. Bigger company, higher multiple. Let's talk about managing margins. So this is easier said than done, I realize, and you've got different flexibilities depending on who your payers are, right? It's managing your margins in a Medicare world where your reimbursement is set is different than managing your margins in a private duty world where you can change your payments or your billing rate. But the first thing you need to do is start measuring your margins. And so, the key margins that you really want to start measuring are your gross margin and your net margin. Okay, so your gross margin is the margin that you have that the business is generating after you've paid for the cost of care. So after you've paid for your clinicians or caregivers, their mileage, supplies, whatever you have left over is your gross profit. If you divide that by your revenue, that's your gross margin. And then from your gross profit, you subtract your overhead. These are the fixed costs. And then from there, you get your net margin. For a hospice, I mentioned before, buyers like to see gross margins in the let's just say 45 to 55% range, net margins in the 15 to 25% range. Home health agency buyers, typically like to see margin sweet spots in the 45 to 50% gross margin, and somewhere between 15 and 25% net margin. And then on the home care side, the lower end tends to drop just a little bit. You want to diversify both your referrals and your clients if you're a home care agency. So, a company that, all things being equal, a company that has, 100 referral sources is going to typically generate a higher multiple than a company that has 10 referrals. Same thing on the private duty side, or similar thing on the private duty side. A company that has, a large number of low hour type clients, maybe it's a few hours a day or a few hours a week, will typically generate a higher multiple than a company that has just a few clients that are 24/7. You want to separate yourself from marketing and day-to-day leadership. The impact on that, again, it's going to increase the multiple. I've mentioned this before. Buyers' biggest concerns and the biggest driver of the multiple is the concern that business is going to deteriorate. Adjusted EBITDA is going to decline after a transaction is completed. And rightfully so, right? Especially if the owner is very, very much involved in the marketing and day-to-day leadership. You know, they might convince you to stick around in the same or similar capacity, but the risk is still there from their perspective, because the motivation from your as the seller is no longer there as the owner. So you want to do everything you can to separate yourself from the marketing and the day-to-day leadership of the company. That'll drive up the multiple. Again, easier said than done. You want to build a transition-proof business, you know, and really ensure the buyer universe that they're going to have success post-closing. Now, some of that includes separating yourself from marketing and the day-to-day leadership, but the other part of that is making sure that the folks that are on the bench, I guess, as they say, your key employees, your key managers, you know, things are aligned so that they are motivated to continue to work for the company after the close. And there are certain ways you can do that. You can incentivize them with stay bonuses and the like. You can bring them inside your circle of trust. This is something that we've talked about a few times. And you know, bringing in those types of folks and giving the buyer the opportunity to talk with those folks. Now, again, helps having a stay bonus for them, right? Something that is meaningful to them, but maybe isn't huge relative to the overall transaction. All these things give buyers comfort that things are going to continue as is, and ultimately they'll pay a higher multiple. And finally, you can consider an acquisition. Not necessarily advocating for this. It's a big undertaking, but it really does check all three boxes. Obviously, if you acquire a company, your revenue should grow because you're hopefully also acquiring their clinicians and caregivers and patients that they're taking care of. Margins will oftentimes improve, especially if it's an acquisition of someone that's either in your market or in a contiguous market where maybe you don't need all of their overhead, right? So that'll trim off. So a lot of that overhead will go away, and most of that gross margin or gross profit of the acquired entity will just drop to your straight to your bottom line. So that'll really bump up your EBITDA margin. And then, of course, bigger company, higher margin, that's going to bump up the multiple as well. Okay, so we talked about building value. Now we're going to talk a little bit about capturing the value. Now, this is something that we have not shared a lot of in the past. So I think these are new concepts to a lot of folks. Sharing what we think are the best practices for, you know, once you've built an exceptional company, you want to take it to market and capture that value. So here's what we do. And here's what we suggest you do. So the first thing you want to do is you want to reach out to all of the A-list buyers confidentially. So how do you do that? Well, first you have to identify the A-list buyers, and the A-list buyers really need to check three boxes. Number one, they have cash. Most of the time they have cash in their operating account. They can do a transaction, or they have access to cash in the form of a credit line that they can easily tap into for the purposes of an acquisition. Box number two, they're in the industry or in a adjoining industry. You know, if you're a home health agency, your best buyer might be a hospice, right? That is looking to combine home health and hospice in the same market. Same thing with home care. You know, the buyer universe typically operates in one of those three sub-industries: home care, home health, or hospice, regardless of which industry you may operate in. And then the third box is they've done deals before. They've done transactions. Most of the time, these companies have development teams that focus almost exclusively, if not exclusively, on doing transaction work. So those are the three buyers. And if you narrow it down, it really consists of two groups of companies. It's a publicly traded companies and the financially backed strategic buyers. So these are the big companies out there that are backed by private equity, family offices, and the like. So those are the A-list buyers. The best way to find them, you can Google them. You can Google, you can research transactions that have been announced and reported over the last couple of years. If you just look at over the last 2 or 3 years, you're going to find most of those buyers that are out there, and there are about 50 or 60 of them that we consider A-list buyers across the country. I think you can acquire a list of transactions that have been consummated over the last few years. I think a company 11 Pro will offer that to you for, I don't know, maybe a few hundred or maybe a couple $1,000s. So that's how you build your A-list buyer list. And there may be some folks locally that you want to add to that list. That A-list buyers is really kind of the foundation, but there may be some highly strategic local folks that you would want to reach out to, but you may want to reach out to them a little bit differently. How do you reach out to them confidentially? My suggestion would be to set up a dedicated confidential email address just for this purpose. And then the first step would be compiling a teaser of the highlights of the company. It'll include an executive summary, some high-level financial information, and enough information that a strategic buyer will look at it, look at the information, say, this looks like something we would have an interest in. I want to sign a non-disclosure agreement, but it's not enough information that they can start to triangulate or speculate who you might be. So you maintain confidentiality. You reach out to all those buyers with that teaser, and you tell them, if you want to learn more about this company, sign our confidentiality agreement. Okay. So we've reached out to the buyers. We've got non-disclosure agreements from hopefully multiple buyers now, A-list buyers. Next thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to provide them some information so they can assess the company and ultimately make an offer. And you're going to do that in the form of a confidential information memorandum. For us, that's usually it's a deck format presentation. It usually is 25 to, let's say, 60 pages, depending on the size and complexity of the agency or the company. Has, highlights all the history, the financial information, patient client metrics, key employees, no names, don't need to give any employee names, referral information, again, no names. So everything about the agency that is compelling from an investment perspective. And again, you don't need to start from scratch to create a SIM. This is something you can get from an industry expert like us or some of our competitors, quite frankly. Most of us are happy to share with you an example of our SIMs, or you can just Google it. They're available online as well. But once you get the NDA back, you want to send them that SIM, which has all that information in it. But it's also going to include a key page in the offering memorandum will be what we call the process letter. And that process letter basically tells them that, number one, this is a competitive process that you're invited to participate in. And then number two, here are kind of the rules of the game. If you want to participate, you're going to have to submit an offer. Usually, if it's a smaller company and you're just dealing with A-list strategic buyers, you want to set an offer date. You usually want to give them somewhere between 4 and 5 weeks to generate a letter of intent. And then you want to specifically spell out the things that they need to include in the letter of intent for it to be considered. And these are the things that are important to you, things like price and terms, et cetera. So you're going to send them that information memorandum. It's going to have the process letter. It's going to remind them that this is a confidential process that they're participating in, and they're invited to make an offer. As you work through the process, you're going to find that there's going to be a handful of buyers that are most interested. And those are the ones that you're going to want to spend a little bit of time getting to know. Our suggestion is, if at all possible, you want to meet with the buyers that plan to make an offer face to face, Ideally, you want to try to schedule those kind of back to back or one day after the next, so you kind of get into a groove. You want to reserve a little bit of meeting space to do that, or you can meet somewhere quiet, just face to face. And it really is an opportunity for them to ask a lot of questions about the company. But it's also an opportunity for you to gauge, why this buyer is interested and if this buyer truly is your best buyer. So it's a two-way process. And again, it reminds the buyer that this is a competitive process and you're kind of evaluating them relative to some of the other buyers. While you're having those discussions, it's always good to acknowledge any and all, potential issues at this point in time. You don't want the buyer to discover something in due diligence that they could have found out earlier in the process that could cause them to want to renegotiate at that period of time. So this is the time to kind of get everything out there. If there's any skeletons in the closet, let them know. And it also builds a little bit of trust from a buyer's perspective, gives them comfort. Beware the uninformed buyer. I talked about the A-list buyers, the folks that really know the industry. That's critical. You don't want to try to educate a buyer that is not an expert in the industry. They're going to find things. Oh, I can only see it, right? They're evaluating your Medicare agency, and 3 months into it, they discovered that this, value-based purchasing is going to be, it's going to be a measurement or performance year next year. And those things can really upset a transaction. So beware of the uninformed buyer, not only industry buyers, but just buyers that don't know everything about your company. One of the things that we see all the time is buyers out there, and these are typically buyers that approach sellers directly. They will make an offer, a letter of intent, based on not much information at all. And that's always concerning. You really want to make sure the buyer knows everything about the company. Obviously, you don't need to share employee names, patient names, or referral sources, but everything else is, or patient IDs, but everything else is fair game. You want to make sure you know what is considered market, both in terms of value and terms. So again, this is something that we'll see, and we see this a lot when buyers approach sellers directly. And a lot of times, if they're, again, a little bit cash strapped, they will negotiate a letter of intent based on reasonableness, right? So, Mr. Seller, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, we think it's reasonable that we hold back 30% of the purchase price just for 3 months after the closing, just to make sure things don't fall off completely. We think that's reasonable. And, to which I would argue, yes, perfectly reasonable, understand where you're coming from, but that's not market. So make sure before you start these negotiations, you really know what is market in terms of value and terms. And again, you can do some research, talk to experts like us. Now's a good time to engage an M&A attorney, especially one that specializes in healthcare services, and ideally someone that has done care at home transactions. They really know what's market and they know how to get deals done. You want to try to avoid monopsony at all costs. A lot of you probably don't know what a monopsony is, and quite frankly, I didn't either until I looked it up. It really just means dealing with one buyer. Want to try to avoid doing that. Sometimes there's a highly strategic buyer that maybe it does make sense to engage with, but if at all possible, you want to create a competitive process. By the way, if you look at the private equity groups, right, these are the guys that make their money by selling companies. Every one of them goes through a process like this, with a few exceptions, and those are the highly strategic deals. Okay, so now you've gone to market, you've shared information, you've narrowed it down to the finalists. And typically there'll be a couple of finalists that'll stand out, and you can negotiate those two somewhat transparently. You don't want to share the details, but let them know that it is a competitive situation. you're talking to two different buyers, and that is fair game to try to negotiate in parallel. But ultimately, you're going to have to select one buyer to go down that road with. You're going to have to sign a letter of intent, and part of the letter of intent, every letter of intent is going to include an exclusivity clause, which means that you're not going to be able to talk with any other buyers for a period of time, usually 60 to 120 days. So you're stuck with them as you go through this due diligence process and start to negotiate an executed or a finalized purchase agreement. So you've selected the buyer that you feel most comfortable with. The strategy aligns. They've got plenty of money. Makes perfect sense. Now, how do you get to the closing table without that buyer wanting to renegotiate? Okay, so I talked about this before. You want to eliminate any blind spots. If you haven't done pre-LOI, now is definitely the time to come clean if there's anything that may be haunting you, whether it be a cap issue for for your hospice, ADRs that you're working through. Probe and educate could be a rack audit. Certainly you'd want to let them know before that. I haven't seen those in a while, but that may be a bad example. But give them everything that they know that they need to submit a sticky letter of intent, and before you give them the gift of exclusivity. And it really is a gift that you're giving them as a result of winning the process. So mitigates potential surprises, and due diligence saves a lot of headaches. So I mentioned going through the process, talking to a number of buyers, and part of the reason that you want to do this is because now you have backup offers, and the buyer that you ultimately engage with is aware of that. Again, you don't have to mention that to them in a non-professional way. You can do it very professionally, but it doesn't hurt to, from time to time, remind them about another discussion you had with another buyer, whatever it may be, just to subtly remind them that they weren't the only game. It keeps them honest. I mentioned this earlier. You may want to consider bringing in key employees into the circle of trust. Going through due diligence, negotiating a purchase agreement is a lot of work. And you want to do that while you continue to run the company, and you want to make sure that the company continues to perform well. And that can be a lot, it can be a lot of work. So, we recommend, and this is a sensitive issue, I realize, but if at all possible, consider bringing in one or two key employees into your circle of trust. Let them know what you're considering. You can incentivize them to stay on at least until the transaction, perhaps past the transaction, with a stay bonus. It really does help in generating due diligence, because more than likely this will be someone that has access to a lot of that diligence that may be harder for you to get, and it takes a lot of the burden off of you. And again, from a buyer's perspective, if they're able to get in front of this key employee and really sell themselves to the employee and get some comfort that employee wants to stick around, that's just going to give them comfort that the business is going to sustain itself after the closing. Be ready to produce standard diligence information. I say this all the time. Time kills all deals. The first step in due diligence will be the buyer will send over a due diligence checklist. And we have sample due diligence checklists. Some of our competitors do, industry specific. Happy to share them with you, just to give you some idea what's in these due diligence requests. And most of them are somewhere between 100 line items and let's say 300 line items long, again, depending on the size and complexity of the transaction. You want to be ready to produce that information, at least know where it is, so that you can produce it very quickly after you get that checklist. Time kills all deals, and you don't want things being held up while you're trying to find things to produce during diligence. You want to maintain strong admissions and hours through the process. Again, this is something that's super important. If the business starts to fall off a little bit. Now, again, the process is going to take a couple months, right? And buyers are going to ask for financial updates as the process goes on. If things start to fall off a little bit, I'm not going to say this happens every time, but it gives buyers cause to want to question what's going on, and perhaps even consider how they're looking at value. So really best to maintain strong admissions. The best companies, the best deals tend to grow through this diligence process, and that tends to give our clients maximum leverage as you go through diligence and negotiate those final purchase agreements. So you want to maintain strong admissions, and it does help to have a little bit of help, especially from a key employee or two. Thanks again for your time. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me personally. My email address is there on the screen. It's Cory@mertztaggart.com, and I'll look forward to hearing from you.